How can a couple adopt an 8-month-old toddler, only to assault her until her tragic death weeks later? If you are not prepared to care for a child, why go through the rigorous process of adoption? If you cannot treat a child with love and kindness, then do not bring one into your life, whether by giving birth or by adopting. Children are a sweet gift from God. They should be nurtured and cared for with the utmost love and attention. When 8-month-old Jong-in was adopted, her church community thought she had finally found a loving home. Unknown to them, the events of the following weeks would lead to the gruesome end of this innocent toddler. Jong-in was subjected to relentless abuse for 271 days. By the time of her death, she had become pale, fragile, and unrecognizable from the vibrant child she once was. The tragic case of Jong-in has revealed the darkest corners of human cruelty and systemic failure. This documentary sheds light on her brief yet impactful life, the horrific abuse she endured, and the institutional lapses that failed to protect her. Please note that this is a deeply sensitive case involving assault and murder. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Welcome to Forbidden Passion. I'm so glad to have you join us for another video. Kindly subscribe, like, and share, and let me know where you are watching from. On June 10, 2019, Jong-in entered the world as a healthy, full-term baby, weighing 3.43 kilograms. Her arrival marked the beginning of a life filled with potential, born to a mother who made the difficult decision to give her up. Unable to care for her child, Jong-in's birth mother entrusted her to the care of a church just 8 days after her birth. Though separated from her biological family, Jong-in was placed in a foster home where she found love and care during her early months. Her foster mother fondly described her as a cheerful and lively baby, her smile lighting up every room she entered. Jong-in loved music, often swaying and clapping her tiny hands to the rhythm, a testament to her joyful spirit. Her laughter was contagious, and those who cared for her during this time remembered her as a symbol of innocence and hope. Though her future was uncertain, her foster family did everything they could to ensure she felt cherished and safe. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly blissful beginning lay the realities of a child navigating a complex system. Jong-in's foster family understood that her stay with them was temporary. They held out hope that she would find a permanent home where her infectious energy and warmth could flourish. For 8 months, they nurtured her, unaware of the darkness that would soon engulf her life. In the summer of 2019, her fate shifted dramatically. Jang Hyung and An Sungin, a couple with a 4-year-old biological daughter, applied to adopt Jong-in. They presented themselves as devout and family-oriented individuals, passing rigorous adoption screenings that included psychological evaluations and home visits. To those involved in the adoption process, they seemed like the perfect candidates to provide Jong-in with the love and stability she deserved. When Jong-in officially joined their family in February 2020, she weighed a healthy 8.5 kilograms, 19 pounds. And her new life seemed filled with promise. Her adoption marked the end of her time in foster care and the start of what was supposed to be a bright new chapter. For her foster mother, it was a bittersweet moment. She bid farewell to the baby she had grown to love, trusting that the adoption system had placed her in capable and caring hands. However, what unfolded after Jong-in's adoption was anything but the life her foster family had envisioned for her. The promises of a loving family turned out to be hollow, and the home that should have been her sanctuary became the site of unimaginable cruelty. The early months of her life, filled with smiles and laughter, would soon give way to silence and suffering. Jang Hyung, born in 1986, was the daughter of a pastor and a daycare owner. Growing up in a household centered on faith and caregiving, she cultivated an image of piety and devotion. Jang attended Handong Global University, an institution known for its Christian values, where she met An Sung-gyun, a fellow student. An, born in 1984, was a diligent and seemingly humble man who later established himself as a producer at CBS, a prominent broadcasting company. Their shared faith and commitment to family values seemed to make them a match made in heaven. As a couple, Jang and An became active members of their church community, where they were often seen as model parishioners. Jang took pride in her role as a mother to their biological daughter, frequently sharing pictures and anecdotes that depicted her as a nurturing and loving parent. Meanwhile, An balanced his demanding career with his family life, quietly supporting Jang in her maternal role. For Jang Hayoung and An Seung-yoon, the adoption of Jongin was presented as an act of compassion, deeply rooted in their shared faith and desire to expand their family. An, a producer at a reputable broadcasting company, and Jang, the daughter of a pastor, seemed to embody the ideals of a devout and stable household. Their outward appearance, marked by religious devotion and family values, convinced many that they were the perfect candidates to provide Jongin with a loving and secure home. The couple had long expressed a desire to give their biological daughter, a bright and lively 4-year-old, the gift of a sibling. Through their church community, they learned about the adoption process and the many children in need of permanent homes. After months of preparation and scrutiny, they met all the requirements set forth by the adoption agency. From psychological evaluations to home inspections, they passed every stage with flying colors. Friends and acquaintances spoke of their excitement and commitment, painting a picture of a family ready to embrace a new chapter in their lives. When Jong-in officially joined their family in February 2020, her presence was initially celebrated. The couple presented her adoption as an extension of their faith and charity, even sharing their joy with their church community. For a moment, it seemed like Jong-in had found the stable, nurturing environment she so desperately needed. However, beneath the surface of this carefully curated image, cracks began to show. While the couple spoke of their intentions to raise Jong-in as their own, subtle signs suggested otherwise. Friends and neighbors noted that Jang's interactions with her adoptive daughter were strained and distant compared to her biological child. These small, seemingly inconsequential observations would later prove to be the earliest indicators of a dark and tragic reality. In the months following the adoption, the family began to withdraw from their church community and social circles, citing the challenges of raising 2 young children during the COVID-19 pandemic. While some sympathized, others wondered if their retreat signaled something more troubling. The promises of love and care that had been so publicly proclaimed now seemed to be fading into silence and isolation. What unfolded behind closed doors during this time was a stark departure from the promises Jang and An had made, not only to Jong-in, but to the system that entrusted her to their care. The warmth and security she had experienced in foster care were replaced by an environment increasingly marked by neglect and disdain. Her cries for attention, once met with gentle reassurance, now brought frustration and anger. However, in the initial weeks following her adoption, pictures shared by Jang Hayoung on social media showcased a smiling baby, and acquaintances assumed the family's transition was smooth. However, behind the curated posts and polite smiles, a much darker truth was beginning to unfold. From the moment Jong-in joined the household, the cracks in Jang and An's facade became visible, at least to those closest to the family. Jang's patience with the young girl wore thin almost immediately. She resented the additional responsibilities, the cries of a baby needing comfort, and the disruptions to her carefully controlled life. The bond she had with her biological daughter starkly contrasted with her cold indifference toward Jong-in. This indifference soon escalated into outright hostility. Instead of seeing Jong-in as a vulnerable child in need of care, Jang began to view her as an unwelcome burden. Little things, an unsteady step, a spilled drink, a crying episode, were met with harsh reprimands or worse. An, meanwhile, adopted a passive role, ignoring the growing tension in the household and failing to intervene as his wife's treatment of the child deteriorated. Within the confines of their home, the abuse took on many forms. Food, once a source of comfort for Jong-in, became a tool of control. Jang withheld meals, leaving the baby hungry and malnourished. When food was given, it was sometimes scalding hot, causing burns to her delicate mouth. Physical punishments for perceived misbehavior became routine. Locked away in dark rooms for hours, Jong-in was deprived of the warmth and attention every child needs. Even the most basic gestures of care, like changing her diaper or bathing her, became acts of resentment. To Jang, these tasks were burdensome chores she approached with contempt. Neighbors occasionally overheard raised voices and crying from the apartment, but dismissed these sounds as the challenges of raising children. As the weeks turned into months, the physical signs of abuse became evident. Jong-in's chubby cheeks thinned out, her bright eyes dulled, and her cheerful disposition faded. She grew quieter, her once vibrant laughter replaced by a silence born of fear. But the outward signs of her suffering remained hidden from the world outside their home. Jang and An's public personas helped shield them from scrutiny. To the daycare workers who met Jong-in and the neighbors who saw her occasionally, Jang presented herself as an overwhelmed but devoted mother. She often spoke of the challenges of raising two children, subtly deflecting any concerns about her younger daughter's well-being. In May 2020, just 3 months after her adoption, the first alarming signs of Jong-in's suffering began to surface. At her daycare, attentive teachers noticed unusual bruises on her small, fragile body, faint but undeniable marks that hinted at something far more sinister than clumsy toddler mishaps. Her behavior had also begun to shift. Once a curious and bright child, she seemed withdrawn, hesitant, and frightened. The daycare workers, bound by their duty of care, didn't ignore these signs. They reported the bruises to local authorities, describing their concerns in detail. For many, such a report would be a pivotal moment, a chance to intervene and prevent further harm. But for Jong-in, it marked the beginning of a pattern of neglect from those meant to protect her. The police dismissed the first report, chalking the bruises up to the natural misadventures of a child still learning to navigate her environment. They conducted a cursory investigation, taking Jang Hyung and An Sung-den's word at face value when they claimed the injuries were accidental. Without speaking further to daycare staff or consulting medical professionals, the case was closed as inconclusive. As weeks turned into months, more signs emerged. Jong-in began arriving at daycare with additional bruises, cuts, and other injuries. Her once healthy frame started to look frail, her face losing the soft fullness of early childhood. Alarmed by her visible deterioration, her daycare teachers filed another report in June 2020. This time, their concerns were accompanied by photographs and detailed descriptions of her condition. The second report prompted another brief investigation, but once again, no concrete action was taken. The police's reluctance to pursue the case stemmed from the couple's outwardly respectable appearance. John, with her composed demeanor, easily deflected suspicions, claiming Jong-in was a clumsy and overly active child. The authorities failed to dig deeper, overlooking the glaring inconsistencies in her explanations. In July 2020, a pediatrician who examined Jong-in also raised concerns. The doctor observed signs of malnutrition, developmental delays, and physical injuries inconsistent with her age. He suspected abuse and urged action, sending another report to Child Welfare Services. This third warning was a crucial opportunity to intervene, yet it too was met with indifference. Bureaucratic delays and a lack of urgency meant that Jong-in was sent back to her adoptive parents without further investigation. By now, the evidence of abuse was mounting, yet the system's repeated failures to act sealed her fate. Each report filed by teachers or medical professionals fell into a void of inaction. The very structures designed to protect vulnerable children were instead enabling her abusers. Despite the growing unease among those who interacted with her, Jong-in's cries for help, spoken not with words but with her deteriorating body and spirit, were systematically ignored. The bruises, the malnutrition, and the behavioral changes all told a story that should have been impossible to overlook. And yet, for Jong-in, every cry, every injury, and every plea went unheard by the adults who could have saved her. October 13, 2020, began like any other day in the household of Jang Hae-young and An Sung-gun. Yet, for 16-month-old Jong-in, it would be her final day, a culmination of months of suffering that would end in tragedy. That morning, Jang's frustrations with Jong-in reached new heights. In a disturbing video recorded on her phone, she documented her repeated attempts to force the injured toddler to walk. Jong-in's cries of pain were audible, her small frame struggling under the weight of her injuries. Despite the child's obvious distress, Jang continued, her tone cold and detached, as though oblivious to the pain she was inflicting. By midday, a loud and violent noise from their apartment caught the attention of a neighbor. Concerned, they knocked on the door, only to be met with Jang's composed demeanor, insisting everything was fine. Behind closed doors, however, Jong-in was fighting for her life.
As we go into the most intense part of this video, kindly like and subscribe to this channel. It gives me motivation to create more videos. If you love this video and wish to see more, kindly subscribe.
Sometime that afternoon, Jang inflicted a devastating blow to Jong-in's abdomen. The impact was catastrophic, causing internal bleeding and the rupture of her pancreas, a fatal injury for a child so small. Yet even after inflicting such harm, Jang waited hours before seeking medical help. At 6:30 p.m., Jang finally brought Jong-in to the hospital. By then, the child was unconscious, her lips blue, and her body cold to the touch. Doctors and nurses scrambled to save her, but their efforts were in vain. At 6:50 p.m., Jong-in was pronounced dead. The medical team's initial examination painted a horrifying picture. Her body bore the scars of prolonged abuse, bruises, scratches, and fractures in various stages of healing. Her abdomen was swollen, and her internal injuries were consistent with severe trauma. The autopsy that followed revealed the full extent of her suffering: multiple fractures, ruptured organs, and evidence of chronic malnutrition. When questioned, Jang claimed that Jong-in had fallen and hit her head, a story that quickly unraveled under scrutiny. The injuries were far too severe to align with her explanation. The attending physician, horrified by what he had seen, immediately reported the case as a suspected child abuse death. The wheels of justice, which had stalled for so long, finally began to turn. News of Jong-in's death spread rapidly, igniting a wave of public outrage. The little girl's tragic end was a brutal wake-up call for a nation that had failed to protect her. Her short life, marked by unimaginable suffering, became a symbol of the urgent need for systemic reform. The death of 16-month-old Jong-in sent shockwaves through South Korea, immediately sparking a criminal investigation that would uncover harrowing details of systemic failures and unimaginable cruelty. The police investigation began with interrogations of Jang Hae-young and An Sung-gun. Jang claimed that Jong-in's injuries were the result of accidental falls, while An portrayed himself as an uninvolved bystander. However, their conflicting statements and lack of remorse raised red flags for investigators. The couple's demeanor during questioning, cold, evasive, and defensive, hinted at deeper malice. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of Jong-in's autopsy report painted a grim picture. Medical examiners found clear evidence of prolonged and escalating abuse: fractured ribs, a ruptured pancreas, and internal bleeding, injuries inconsistent with any accidental trauma. Experts confirmed that these injuries were the result of repeated physical violence. Her autopsy revealed malnourishment, indicating she had been systematically starved for months. Investigators also reviewed daycare records, medical visits, and the 3 previously filed abuse reports, which revealed a pattern of negligence on the part of authorities. Teachers had reported suspicious bruises and Jong-in's declining health multiple times, but each case had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence or lack of follow-through. This systemic failure allowed her abusers to continue inflicting harm without fear of intervention. Public outrage intensified as details of the case surfaced. South Korean citizens flooded social media with calls for justice, sharing the hashtag #SorryJong-in to honor the young victim. Protests erupted outside police stations, demanding accountability not only from the adoptive parents but also from law enforcement and child welfare agencies that had failed to act on repeated warnings. The investigation also scrutinized adoption agencies and their vetting processes. How could a couple so ill-suited for parenthood pass the rigorous screenings? These questions fueled widespread criticism of the adoption system, prompting government officials to announce plans for an internal review. As the evidence mounted, prosecutors prepared a case that would expose the full extent of Jang and An's actions. Surveillance footage from the couple's home, recovered texts, and phone recordings further implicated them, revealing their disdain for Jong-in and callous disregard for her well-being. Each piece of evidence painted a damning portrait of premeditated abuse, shifting the narrative from negligence to deliberate cruelty. By the end of October 2020, the investigation had gathered enough evidence to charge Jang Ha-young with murder and child abuse, while An Sung-gun faced charges of child neglect. Their arrests marked the beginning of a legal battle that would captivate the nation and redefine South Korea's approach to child protection. The trial of Jang Ha-young and An Sung-gun became one of the most scrutinized legal proceedings in South Korea's history. Beginning in early 2021, the courtroom was not just a place for justice, but a public forum where the grief, rage, and demands of an entire nation came to the forefront. Jong-in's case had grown into a symbol of systemic failure and societal neglect, and the courtroom was filled daily with reporters, activists, and members of the public. Jang faced the most serious charges: murder and aggravated child abuse. Prosecutors described her as a calculating and unrepentant individual who saw Jong-in not as a daughter, but as an obstacle. They presented a damning case, supported by evidence of her escalating abuse, including forensic reports, text messages, and video footage recovered from her phone. These recordings showed Jang mocking and physically assaulting the toddler, who often appeared terrified and unresponsive. The most harrowing moment came when the prosecution played audio recordings captured by neighbors, in which Jong-in's screams and cries echoed through the thin apartment walls. Coupled with medical testimony detailing the severity of her injuries, the evidence painted an irrefutable picture of deliberate and repeated violence. An, meanwhile, was charged with neglect and complicity. Though he denied direct involvement in the abuse, the prosecution argued that his willful inaction made him equally culpable. Witness testimonies from relatives and acquaintances described him as passive and indifferent, ignoring clear signs of his wife's violence toward Jong-in. One neighbor recounted how An once dismissed concerns about loud noises, saying, "She cries all the time, it's annoying." The defense's strategy revolved around minimizing intent. Jang's lawyers claimed that her actions stemmed from frustration and a lack of parental experience, not malice. They insisted that Jong-in's fatal injuries were accidental, caused by a sudden fall. However, this argument was systematically dismantled by medical experts who demonstrated how the injuries could only have been inflicted through forceful trauma. Public outrage against the defense team's tactics reached a boiling point during Jang's testimony. When asked to explain her actions, Jang offered curt, emotionless responses and refused to apologize. Her demeanor, cold and detached, fueled nationwide contempt. Social media erupted with condemnation, with many calling her a monster in human form. As the trial progressed, activists and ordinary citizens gathered outside the courthouse, holding banners and chanting slogans demanding justice for Jong-in. The media dubbed the proceedings the trial of monsters, reflecting the public's unanimous vilification of the defendants. By the time the verdict was announced in May 2021, the trial had become a landmark case in South Korea's legal and cultural history. The judge sentenced Jang Ha-young to life imprisonment for murder, a penalty later commuted to 35 years on appeal. An Sung-gun received a 5-year sentence for neglect and aiding in the abuse. The court's rationale emphasized that Jong's actions were not merely negligent, but constituted premeditated violence, while An's failure to intervene rendered him complicit in the tragedy. The sentencing sparked mixed reactions. For some, it was a relief to see the legal system finally holding abusers accountable. For others, the punishments felt insufficient, particularly for An, whose perceived leniency ignited debates about the justice system's approach to child abuse. The case of Jong-in sparked a massive outcry both within South Korea and internationally. The severity of the abuse she endured and her tragic death generated widespread outrage and calls for systemic reform. As details of her suffering became public, many in South Korea were horrified by the inaction of authorities, particularly the police and child protection services, who failed to act on multiple reports of abuse despite clear evidence. These failures were seen as a major factor in Jong-in's death, which fueled the public's anger. The national outcry reached its peak after the investigative TV show Unanswered Questions aired an episode that deeply examined the case and its underlying issues. The show's shocking revelations, including the dismissal of earlier child abuse reports, resonated with the public, sparking protests and widespread demands for reform. Thousands of citizens rallied in the streets, calling for justice for Jong-in and for the adoption of stronger child protection laws. The hashtag #SorryJongin trended on social media as a means of raising awareness about child abuse and promoting change. Jong-in's case led to discussions about the inadequacies of the child welfare system in South Korea, specifically the gaps in monitoring adopted children and the failure to properly investigate suspected abuse. The emotional toll on the public was compounded by the fact that authorities had numerous opportunities to intervene, but did not. This contributed to a growing sense of frustration and anger over the perceived lack of accountability for the adoptive parents, especially her adoptive father, who claimed ignorance of the abuse despite the overwhelming evidence. The outrage also prompted a broader conversation about the importance of protecting children and ensuring that they have access to safe, supportive environments. Calls for reform focused on making it easier for authorities to investigate and intervene in child abuse cases, including revisiting the process of reporting and following up on abuse allegations, as well as enhancing training for police and child welfare workers. The national outcry surrounding Jong-in's case highlighted the need for stricter laws, greater transparency in investigations, and more stringent oversight of adoptive parents. In response to the public pressure, some legal reforms were proposed, but the case also highlighted ongoing challenges in achieving effective systemic change. Jong-in's story became a rallying cry for those advocating for better protection of vulnerable children and for a more compassionate and responsive legal system. The tragic case of Jong-in highlights several important lessons about child protection, responsibility, and systemic failure. Here are the key takeaways. 1. Vigilance in child welfare. Jong-in's case underscores the importance of maintaining vigilance when it comes to children's well-being, especially in situations involving adopted children or children from potentially vulnerable backgrounds. The multiple reports of abuse should have triggered immediate intervention, yet the failure of authorities to act on those reports led to a devastating outcome. The need for effective systems. Jong-in's death is a result of systemic failures. There were numerous opportunities to intervene, but the police, child protection agencies, and medical professionals failed to properly investigate the abuse, allowing it to continue unchecked. The case calls for reforms in child protection systems, ensuring that reports of abuse are taken seriously and investigated thoroughly without bias or neglect. 3. Parental responsibility. Both adoptive parents, especially the mother, demonstrated extreme neglect and abuse, ignoring the child's cries for help and causing unimaginable suffering. This case highlights the critical role of parental responsibility and the need for proper screening and monitoring of adoptive parents to prevent abuse. 4. Raising awareness of child abuse. The widespread outrage in South Korea and beyond after Jong-in's death demonstrates the power of public awareness and activism. The #Sorry Jong-in campaign highlighted the need for stronger laws and more awareness about child abuse. It is essential to foster a society that is more attuned to the signs of child abuse and advocates for justice and child safety. 5. The role of institutions and community. Institutions such as daycare centers and child protection agencies need to be more proactive and involved in the safety of children under their care. The daycare teachers, who raised alarms about Jong-in's condition, played a crucial role in bringing attention to the situation. It is important for communities and individuals to work together to protect vulnerable children and report any signs of harm.
Loved what you saw? Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to join our growing community. Your support keeps us creating.